before you unfolds a captivating tale of a time when the world beyond known borders beckoned with its mystery and the unknown. Imagine a world map from centuries past, where instead of precise outlines and modern names, only hazy shapes stretch out, and unknown lands are marked as terra incognita. In those days, the imagination conjured up images of unseen monsters in these unexplored corners of the map, reflecting fear and curiosity about what lay beyond the horizon. However, starting in the 15th century, humanity began to boldly erase these blank spots from the world map. With the creak of helms and the roar of swelling sails, intrepid seafarers embarked on dangerous expeditions, guided by the stars and dreams of new lands. This era became a turning point in history when civilizations separated by oceans met face to face for the first time. Continents that had existed in isolation became part of a single world history. As a result of these discoveries, new trade routes emerged, mighty empires flourished, and the first global markets were formed. Knowledge in the fields of geography, astronomy, and history spread with incredible speed, changing people's perception of the world and their place in it. However, triumphal discoveries also brought with them contradictory consequences. The era of great geographical achievements turned into colonial domination, the destruction of original cultures, and the genocide of entire peoples. It was then that the world in its modern guise was born, with its undeniable achievements and deep wounds. This narrative is not just a chronicle of maritime expeditions and geographical maps, but a story of the unquenchable thirst for human knowledge, immeasurable ambitions, and tragic sacrifices. We will delve into this story slowly and delicately, so that together with the reader, to the quiet rustle of pages past, we can indulge in reflection and, perhaps, fall asleep with a peaceful smile, carried away by thoughts through the veil of time. Chapter 1. The Prelude to Discovery. Part 1. The Allure of Spices and Gold. The world of the 15th century was radically different from the modern one. Europeans did not yet know the invigorating taste of coffee, the exciting aroma of vanilla, or the exotic sweetness of pineapple. But one thing was known for sure: Oriental spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, were worth their weight in gold. In the dark and drafty castles of medieval Europe, spices were not just a gastronomic delicacy, but a symbol of power and wealth. A small amount of pepper could cost a simple artisan a day's wages. Cinnamon served as an adornment for the magnificent feathers of noble persons, and nutmeg in European lands was considered not only a culinary marvel, but almost a magical remedy for all sorts of ailments. However, the road to these fragrant treasures was thorny and full of dangers. Merchants, overcoming vast deserts and inaccessible mountains along the legendary Silk Road, passed precious bags of spices from hand to hand, from one merchant to another, as if in a relay race, with each adding their percentage to the cost. And when these treasures finally reached Venice, their price became truly astronomical. It was in Venice and other prosperous Italian ports that the immense riches of the East were concentrated. However, the monopoly of the Italian cities aroused increasing discontent among the rising European powers, such as Spain and Portugal. They were eager to find alternative routes, dreaming of bypassing intermediaries and reaching the original source of treasures directly, conquering the seas. But it was not only exotic spices that attracted Europeans. Gold, that eternal symbol of wealth and power, also haunted them. Africa, India, The mysterious islands of gold depicted on ancient maps stirred the imagination and fueled ambitions. People believed in the existence of lands where gold could be gathered like ripe fruit from trees, believed in the legendary El Dorado, in the kingdom of the mythical Prester John, in the fabulous riches of the East. And they were drawn to these distant worlds not only by the desire for profit, but also by the thirst for glory, power, and an immortal name in historical chronicles. So in the port cities of Europe, lively conversations did not subside at night. Merchants, brave captains, ambitious kings, and fearless adventurers discussed in hushed tones distant lands, fragrant spices, sparkling golden cities, and seas that no one had yet dared to cross. Cartographers redrew maps, compasses were carefully checked, and destinies were preparing for inevitable changes. Thus, a new era was born not on the fields of bloody battles, but in bold dreams of the unique taste of cloves and the dazzling shine of gold. Section 2. Revolutionary navigation technologies. To boldly break away from inhabited shores and bravely plunge into the uncharted sea, a burning desire alone was clearly not enough. The art of navigation became vital in the vast water labyrinths, where there were no familiar landmarks or signs. Only the shimmering stars above and the receding horizon served as unreliable guides. Each innovative invention, each technology that instilled confidence in the conquerors of the waves, became a momentous step towards the age of great geographical discoveries. The first and undoubtedly most crucial moment was the improvement of the compass. This instrument, which traveled a long path from China through Arab lands to Europe, became a steadfast companion for seafarers. As the outlines of familiar shores faded into the distance, the unwavering magnetic needle continued to point north, allowing ships to maintain their course even in inclement weather. Following the compass came the astrolabe and quadrant, instruments that made it possible to determine latitude by the position of celestial bodies. Captains and navigators now had to be able to read not only nautical charts, but also star atlases. The stars transformed into words, and the celestial vault became a priceless scroll containing navigational information. Simultaneously, the development of nautical charts, portolans, was underway. These charts depicted coastlines, bays, hazardous areas, and prevailing wind directions with remarkable accuracy. Each such chart was a priceless treasure, not only because of its precision, but also thanks to the accumulated practical knowledge passed down from generation to generation by experienced sailors. The significance of ships in this era of great change cannot be overstated. The caravel, a symbol of innovation, was a light, maneuverable vessel, capable of traversing the vastness of the oceans. Its design harmoniously combined the shipbuilding traditions of the northern and southern seas. Sails ingeniously designed to catch the wind at various angles, a sturdy hull, and a spacious deck. All enabled caravels to undertake long sea voyages, remaining in the open sea for weeks without relying on coastal navigation. Alongside caravels, other navigational instruments played an important role. Sandglasses for accurate timekeeping, nautical logs for recording the distance traveled, sounding lines for determining depth, and marine sextants for navigation by the stars. All of this contributed to the formation of a new culture among sailors, a culture of professionalism, precision, and self-assurance. The compass, stars, sails, and maps, united together, transformed sea voyages from a desperate leap into the unknown into a well-thought-out, albeit risky, undertaking. Thanks to these technological advancements, the seas ceased to be a frightening boundary, becoming corridors connecting different worlds. Those who first dared to travel these sea routes forever changed the course of history. In this captivating historical drama, Portugal and Spain played the leading roles. These countries, full of ambition and a thirst for change, were ready to turn the world upside down with their discoveries and conquests. Portugal rightfully bears the title of Mistress of the Seas. In the 15th century, despite its modest territory, Portugal possessed boundless ambitions, transforming itself into a maritime empire born on the western edge of Europe, in the quiet of monastery walls and under the shadow of ancient castles. The driving force of this era was Prince Henry the Navigator, who, despite his aversion to sea voyages, founded a navigation school in Sagres, uniting outstanding astronomers, cartographers, engineers, and the best sailors from all over Europe. Under his leadership, Portuguese ships methodically explored the west coast of Africa, discovering new lands, establishing trade relations, and studying ocean currents. Each expedition became an important step towards great discoveries. The Canary Islands, Madeira, the Azores, Cape Bojador, Guinea, and other lands were gradually revealed to the world. The main goal of these voyages was to find a sea route to India, which would bypass the territories controlled by Muslim states and Italian merchants. In 1498, Vasco da Gama made a historic voyage, rounding Africa, reaching India, and arriving in Calicut. His triumphant return to Portugal was the realization of a cherished dream. Access to eastern spices was opened, and the Portuguese created a network of fortified trading posts along the coasts of Africa, in India, Malacca, and even in Japan. The Portuguese did not strive to conquer vast continents. They were interested in key trading hubs and establishing control over sea routes. Portuguese ships sailed between Lisbon and Macau, laying the first sea route spanning the entire world. Spain, a state striving for new horizons and great achievements, opened its doors to the age of geographical discoveries, leaving an indelible mark on human history. At the end of the 15th century, when the country united under the scepter of the Catholic monarchs Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, its ambitions did not allow it to remain in the shadow of other powers. In 1492, the Reconquista culminated triumphantly with the expulsion of the Moors from Granada, strengthening Spain's position on the world stage. Shortly after this momentous event, the royal couple decided to finance the expedition of Christopher Columbus, a daring Genoese navigator who believed it was possible to reach India by sailing west. Though Columbus was mistaken about his route, his error proved to be fateful. Instead of India, he opened the New World to European civilization, a continent full of mysteries and unexplored opportunities. This discovery marked the beginning of a new era in human history. Spain quickly realized the strategic importance of the new lands and their potential. The first expedition was followed by others, led by conquistadors driven by a thirst for gold and glory. They conquered the Aztec and Inca empires, transforming America into a Spanish dream, a symbol of colossal wealth and a base for spreading culture, religion, and political influence. During the Age of Exploration, Portugal and Spain, bound by alliance but also rivals, recognized the scale of the world unfolding before them. To avoid open-armed conflict, they signed the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, dividing the globe into two spheres of influence. According to this treaty, all lands west of the established line went to Spain, while territories to the east went to Portugal, thus defining the geopolitical map of the world for many years to come. This agreement resulted in a peculiar situation. Brazil came under Portuguese rule, extending slightly east of the established boundary, while the rest of the New World went to Spain. Although other states later violated these terms, it was Portugal and Spain that laid the foundation for Europe's global expansion. Their ships cut through the seas. Their flags proudly flew over new territories. The language, culture, and religious beliefs of these countries spread across the world like waves rippling across water. With each new discovery, with each new port, the world map gradually filled in. Unknown territories disappeared, and uncertainty receded into the past. Chapter 2 focuses on the 15th century and tells the story of the journey east and the discovery of the New World. The first part of this chapter examines Portugal's sea routes and its first steps into the unknown. In the early 15th century, Europe was in a state of relative stagnation. From time to time, Europeans heard tales of Eastern wonders, luxurious silks and fragrant spices, magnificent palaces of great khans, and markets filled with the scents of cinnamon and amber. However, the journey to these lands was complex and lengthy. Caravans crossed mountain ranges and vast deserts before reaching ports on the Mediterranean Sea. Then the goods were resold, taxed, and levied with duties, and only a small fraction of them reached Western Europe. The kingdoms of Portugal and Castile, located on the western edge of the European continent, turned their gaze to the vast ocean, as if to an unexplored book full of secrets and opportunities. The lands behind them were already well studied and cultivated, while ahead lay only water, dotted with shimmering stars. Prince Henry the Navigator, the younger son of King Joab I, became the key figure who set the age of exploration in motion, though he himself did not make sea voyages. It was thanks to his efforts that Portugal took the lead on the maritime frontier. He founded a scientific and navigational center in Sagres, which became a true forge of knowledge, gathering the best cartographers, experienced navigators, and talented astronomers. There, ancient Arabic maps were studied, new compasses were tested, and promising sea routes were developed. From then on, the entire Atlantic was seen not as a source of fear and danger, but as a potential path to new lands and riches, as a bold challenge for daring seafarers. At Henry's initiative, Portuguese ships began methodically, step by step, exploring the west coast of Africa. It was a long and difficult process, requiring immense patience and courage. First, Madeira and the Azores were discovered, then the Canary Islands, which were disputed with Castile. Further south lay a mysterious land, where the scorching sun became unbearable, and ocean currents changed as if nature itself resisted further progress. But the Portuguese seafarers did not give up. Each new cape, each island, each settlement of local people with whom contact was established was carefully recorded, mapped, and became part of new, invaluable knowledge. Thus, gradually, the route to India, running along the African continent, was opened. Over time, Portuguese fleets, like unquenchable adventurers, ventured further south, leaving Senegal behind and discovering the mouth of the Gambia River. They explored the uncharted shores of Guinea, engaging in trade with the locals, sometimes peacefully and sometimes with weapons. Their main goal was to find a sea route to India, but they did not yet realize how long and difficult this journey would be. Many expeditions returned to Portugal empty-handed, and some disappeared without a trace. But the indomitable desire for new discoveries did not fade. By the mid-15th century, Portugal had established a network of fortified trading posts along the African coast. Coveted spices remained an unattainable dream, but gold from the rich interior regions of West Africa was already flowing in a wide stream to the markets of Lisbon, fueling further expansion. In 1492, an unexpected turn occurred, changing the course of history. Spain, finally recovered from centuries of struggle with the Moors, triumphantly completed the Reconquista. At the same time, in the shadow of festive celebrations, a man arrived at the court of King Isabella and Ferdinand, destined to change the world map forever, without even suspecting it. Christopher Columbus, a native of Genoa, was obsessed with the idea of reaching India by moving west across the Atlantic Ocean. Many monarchs refused to support him, doubting the accuracy of his calculations. However, Spain, seeking not to lag behind Portugal in the race for new lands and riches, decided to give Columbus a chance. He was provided with 3 ships that later became legendary: the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And in August 1492, this small flotilla left the port of Palos de la Frontera to change the world forever. The ships, driven by a dream, cut through the boundless waters, carrying the crew into the unknown. The seas stretched to the horizon, as if testing the endurance of the spirit. Anxiety and calm tormented the hearts of the seafarers, causing faith in a successful outcome to fade. However, in October, after long months of uncertainty, the long-awaited land appeared before the eyes of the travelers. Columbus, convinced of his correctness, believed that he had reached the outskirts of Asia and called the locals Indians, unaware that his discovery would mark the appearance of a new continent on the world map. Only later would this land be named America in honor of Amerigo Vespucci, a navigator who was able to assess the true scale of what had happened. Columbus's triumphant return to Spain was accompanied by stories of fertile lands, unseen animals, and people with copper-colored skin. He was greeted as a hero, and Spain realized that it was entering an era of great geographical discoveries and colonial ambitions. The year 1492 became a symbol not only of the completion of the Reconquista, but also of the beginning of a new era in human history. It was in this year that Christopher Columbus, driven by an indomitable thirst for discovery, changed the perception of the world without fully realizing the significance of his action. Christopher Columbus, a native of Genoa, dreamed of sea adventures from a young age, not of weaving. He sailed the seas, listened to the stories of experienced sailors, studied maps, and came to the conclusion that the Earth was smaller than commonly believed, and Asia was very close. Columbus was convinced that by moving west, it was possible to reach India, circumnavigating the globe. Columbus addressed various European courts with this daring idea, but his arguments met with skepticism and ridicule. Despite the fact that some scientists already recognized the sphericity of the Earth, Columbus's calculations seemed too bold and inaccurate. He significantly underestimated the distance between Europe and Asia, but monarchs were willing to take a risk. Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the Catholic monarchs of Spain, sought to surpass Portugal's successes in Africa and provided Columbus with a fleet and funds to implement his ambitious plan. Columbus had 3 caravels at his disposal: the Santa Maria, which became the flagship, as well as the Pinta and the Niña. The crews of these ships were formed in a hurry. Not all members of the team were convinced of the success of the expedition, but there were daredevils willing to take a risk and go into the unknown. On August 3rd, 1492, the flotilla left the port of Palos de la Frontera, heading for the Canary Islands, from where the travelers intended to move into the boundless Atlantic Ocean. Beyond the horizon lay only the unknown, filled with guesses, fears, and the glimmer of distant stars. The sea voyage dragged on for many weeks, testing the patience of the sailors. The ships fell into a calm, provisions were inexorably depleted, and discontent grew among the team, fueled by rumors of a possible mutiny. Columbus, realizing the fragility of the situation, resorted to cunning. Every evening in the ship's log, he recorded two values for the distance traveled, the real one and a deliberately underestimated one, so as not to sow panic among the crew. He concealed the true scale of the journey from his companions, protecting them from despair. And so, finally, on October 12th, 1492, after 70 long days sailing into the endless distance, one of the sailors on the Pinta spotted a faint light in the night, and at dawn, the long-awaited land appeared before the eyes of the sailors. It was Guanahani Island, part of the Bahamas archipelago. Columbus, stepping ashore, raised the Spanish flag and proclaimed this land a possession of the Spanish crown. He was convinced that he had reached the outskirts of India, hence the name Indians, which he gave to the indigenous inhabitants. He mistook the islands of the Caribbean Sea for the coastal territories of Asia. He did not yet realize that he was on the threshold of discovering the New World, a continent destined to radically change the course of world history. Christopher Columbus made 4 sea voyages, as a result of which Europeans became aware of Cuba, Haiti, and the coasts of Central America. However, until the end of his days, the navigator believed that he had reached the shores of India. In a scientific sense, he did not discover America, but rather met it, pointing the way that subsequently led to a wave of conquests, colonization, trade, and bloodshed. Nevertheless, his name is forever etched in history. Columbus became a symbol of the age of great geographical discoveries, a man who lit a spark from which a whole ocean of opportunities ignited. Thousands followed in his footsteps: soldiers, missionaries, merchants, and cartographers. He was the first to dare to cross uncharted waters for the sake of his dream. And although the New World was not named in his honor, his indomitable spirit of discovery became his eternal legacy. Long before Columbus landed in the Caribbean, and long before Vasco da Gama dropped anchor in the Indian port of Calicut, in a small corner of Europe lived a man who, without leading expeditions, made all future discoveries possible. This was Enrique, known in history as Henry the Navigator. He was neither king, nor commander, nor priest, but he was a visionary, a man whose gaze was directed not at the earth, but beyond the horizon. Prince Henry, clad not in royal robes, but rather in the armor of an adventurer, was the third son of King John I. Fate did not seem to be preparing him for the throne, and he turned his gaze to the vast expanses of the sea, where other horizons beckoned. He was a man of the Renaissance, deeply educated, with an inquisitive mind, eager for knowledge of astronomy, geography, and navigation. He was drawn not only by the glitter of gold and fleeting glory. Henry sought to comprehend the mysteries of the universe, to unravel the secrets of the universe. Where others saw only the edge of the earth, washed by the ocean, he foresaw the beginning of uncharted paths. In an era when superstitious fear gripped the hearts of sailors, preventing them from sailing far from the shore, a daring plan for a global world was already ripening in his mind, and he began to implement it. In the mid-15th century, Prince Henry founded a unique institution in Sagres, at the very tip of southwestern Europe, the prototype of a modern research center. He gathered under his aegis the best minds of the time: Arab astronomers, Jewish mathematicians, Italian cartographers, and brave Portuguese seafarers. Here, on a cliff swept by salty winds, the first authentic sea charts are born, combining the knowledge and experience of different cultures. Learned men painstakingly compare data, create new treatises, and test navigational instruments. Compasses and astrolabes. It was a true incubator of the age of great geographical discoveries, where step by step, meticulously and methodically, a path was laid along the African continent. Henry was convinced that the sea route to India lay through the west coast of Africa, and it could be found by moving forward slowly, without reckless jerks, but with patience and perseverance, methodically overcoming one section after another. Cape Bojador, long shrouded in myths and fears, seemed to ancient sailors the edge of the world, beyond which, they believed, lay boiling abysses and raging fiery whirlwinds. However, the maritime expedition, organized by the will of Prince Henry the Navigator, dared to circumnavigate this ominous cape, and instead of the expected apocalypse, travelers found only calm waters, rich in fish shoals and silence, broken only by the blowing of the wind. Then Cape Verde and the coasts of Guinea appeared on the sea charts. Ships increasingly returned to harbors, laden not only with strange news, but also with precious gold, ivory, and exotic goods, unseen in Europe. This influx of wealth had a beneficial effect on the economy, strengthened confidence in its own strength, and stimulated further geographical discoveries. Along the African coast, trading posts began to emerge, the first colonial settlements, the prototypes of a future global network. It is worth noting that these maritime enterprises were by no means always triumphal. They were rarely accompanied by displays of heroism, more often by grueling difficulties and agonizing doubts. But therein lay their enduring value. They laid the foundation upon which more celebrated navigators and explorers would later tread. A unique type of maritime thinking was being formed, based on a thirst for knowledge and overcoming the unknown. Following Henry the Navigator, other seafarers rushed to the African shores. With each passing year, their ships advanced further south, to the mouths of the Niger River, to the shores of the Congo, to the islands of Sao Tome. Unfortunately, these routes would later lead to one of the most tragic consequences of the Age of Discovery, the transatlantic slave trade. But back then, in the distant 15th century, it still seemed that the driving force behind these expeditions was the desire for enlightenment, the exploration of new lands, and the understanding of the world around them. In 1460, fate cut short Henry's life, not allowing him to witness the triumphal achievements of the 15th century, nor to see Columbus or da Gama. However, he did manage to observe how his ships, like an artist's brush, applied new outlines to the world map. He sowed seeds that were destined to bring a rich, albeit controversial, harvest. His legacy is that of a quiet revolutionary. Unlike the power-hungry conquistadors, Henry did not seek to conquer peoples. He did not erect crosses on foreign lands or build triumphal arches in honor of his victories. His goal was to build mutual understanding between cultures, and it was through this that he changed the world. The memory of him lives not in cold bronze statues, but in the events that occurred after his death, when the contours of the world map became increasingly clear, the coastlines became more distinct, and humanity realized that the earth is vast but united, that it can be studied and understood. The path laid by Prince Henry was neither simple nor quick, but it became the road by which humanity emerged from the darkness of myths towards the light of discovery. Chapter 3 is dedicated to the 15th century, an era of circumnavigational dreams and the birth of colonialism. The first part of this chapter will focus on Vasco da Gama's voyage. By the end of the 15th century, Portugal had already created a whole network of advanced outposts along the African coast, each of which was like a bead on a string, each cape like a knot holding the memory of the journey. The Portuguese advanced step by step, as if cautiously feeling the surrounding darkness, until they finally reached the southernmost tip of the continent, the Cape of Good Hope, discovered by Bartolomeu Dias in 1488. It was there, where the waters of the Atlantic Ocean meet the Indian Ocean, that the dawn of a new era broke. However, the cherished goal remained unchanged: to establish a sea route to India, eliminating all intermediaries and reaching the very source of precious spices. And so, in 1497, Portugal was ready to take this daring step. Vasco da Gama, a representative of a noble family, but not burdened by a high title, was entrusted to lead the expedition. This sailor was distinguished by his determination, observation skills, taciturnity, and most importantly, a complete lack of fear of the boundless silence of the ocean, of this silent challenge. Thus, on July 8, 1497, a flotilla consisting of 4 ships, the flagship of which was the São Gabriel, set out from Lisbon. Having rounded the Canary Islands and Madeira, they continued their journey along the African coast, following an already trodden route. But beyond the Cape of Good Hope, a truly fascinating journey began, into uncharted waters, where the maps were pristine and the legends were incredibly colourful. Da Gama made a strategically correct decision. Instead of sticking to the coastline, he boldly turned southwest into the open ocean to take advantage of the favourable southern trade winds. It was a risky manoeuvre, but it was precisely this that allowed the Portuguese to quickly round the African continent and reach its eastern coast. The flotilla dropped anchor in Mozambique, then in Mombasa, and finally reached Malindi, a city ruled by Arab sheikhs and where monsoon winds came from distant India. With the help of an experienced local pilot who knew the sea routes well, in May 1498, the Portuguese ships crossed the Indian Ocean and arrived in Calicut, a bustling port in southwestern India. It was a triumph bordering on the incredible. As if by fate, the ships of the newcomers dropped anchor off the coast of India, and the sailors entered into negotiations with the local rulers. It should be noted that they were not the first foreigners to set foot on this land. Indian markets had long welcomed Arab, Chinese, and Persian merchants. However, the Europeans appeared from the south, as if emerging from the depths of the sea, bringing with them goods that seemed like gifts from a new era. The negotiations proved difficult. The gifts brought by the Portuguese did not make the expected impression on the Indian rulers. Woolen cloaks, coral beads, and barrels of wine did not arouse much enthusiasm. But the Europeans had a cherished goal: to establish trade. Eventually, they were allowed to acquire a small batch of spices, allspice, fragrant cinnamon, and cloves. With jubilation, the sailors loaded this treasure into the holds of their ships and set off on their return journey in August. The road home proved to be full of trials. The crew suffered from disease, fierce storms, and hunger. Almost half of the sailors did not survive this arduous voyage. But in July 1499, Vasco da Gama returned to Lisbon, where he was greeted as a national hero. He proved to the world that India was reachable by sea. The sea is not an insurmountable obstacle, but a bridge connecting continents. After this triumphant return, the world could no longer remain the same. The sea route, laid by da Gama, became a new vital artery of world trade. Encouraged by the success, the Portuguese immediately sent the next expedition to India, larger and better prepared. They began to build fortresses, make alliances with local rulers, and wage wars for influence. The Indian Ocean gradually turned into their zone of dominance. Vasco da Gama visited India more than once, the second time as viceroy, endowed with military power and political authority. His name will forever remain in history textbooks. His ships will become a symbol of courage and audacity. His sea route will form the basis of the colonial system. But in that distant 1498, he only slightly opened the door to a new world. And beyond that door, a new era began to spin rapidly. From Lisbon to Goa, from Malacca to Japan, ships stretched along the African coast, transporting goods, people, ideas, and unfortunately, cannons. Thus, the first global trading system was born, which brought untold riches to Europe, but turned into destruction for many other peoples. The world changed forever, and it all started with one ship, which, guided by the stars and an unquenchable thirst for knowledge of the unknown, left a quiet harbor and discovered India for the Europeans. By the end of the 15th century, Portugal had already created a chain of outposts along the African coast. These ports, like links in a necklace, and capes, like marks in memory, marked their advancement. The Portuguese, as if groping for the unknown, gradually advanced south until in 1488, Bartolomeu Dias reached the southern tip of the continent, called the Cape of Good Hope. In this place, where the Atlantic Ocean meets the Indian Ocean, the light of a new era dawned. If Vasco da Gama's journey proved the possibility of reaching the east by sea, then the next great voyage accomplished something even bolder. It confirmed that the Earth is spherical and can be circumnavigated. At the head of this expedition was Ferdinand Magellan, whose name became the personification of determination and unparalleled courage. Portuguese by birth, sailor by vocation, he served Spain, demonstrating how personal convictions can overcome borders, intrigues, and even geographical obstacles. His idea was that the Spice Islands, Moluccas, could be reached by moving west, not through the Atlantic and Panama, as Columbus assumed, but through the southern latitudes, bypassing the southern tip of America and entering the unexplored Pacific Ocean. This idea did not find support from the Portuguese monarch, but Spain, seeking to bypass Portugal and gain access to sources of wealth, supported Magellan's project. As a result, an expedition of 5 ships was organized: Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago, which sailed from Seville on September 20th, 1519. Through stormy winds, ice floes, and the rebellious spirit of the crew, the expedition, which began along the usual sea routes, passing the Canary Islands and the coasts of South America, soon faced severe trials. The sailors bravely searched for a passage, a winding path among the southern lands of the continent. In the area of the modern Strait of Magellan, they were awaited by dense fogs, impregnable rocks, and fierce storms. One of the ships met its death in the abyss. Another, seized by faint-heartedness, deserted and returned to Spanish waters. Only 3 ships managed to break through this gloomy labyrinth and enter the hitherto unexplored ocean, christened the Pacific by Magellan, for the apparent and deceptive calm of its first waters. However, the voyage across the Pacific Ocean turned into a long and agonizing ordeal. For 3 long months, the crew suffered from a lack of fresh food and drinking water, and scurvy mowed down the sailors. In desperation, they ate leather belts, rats, and even boiled sawdust. And then, on March 6, 1521, land appeared on the horizon. These were the Mariana Islands, followed by the Philippines. An unexpected ending and an endless continuation. In the Philippines, Magellan made an alliance with one of the local leaders, converting residents to Christianity and dreaming of turning these lands into a stronghold of faith. But having intervened in intertribal conflicts, he met his death in the battle on the island of Mactan on April 27, 1521. After the tragic loss of their leader, the burden of command fell upon Juan Sebastián Elcano, under whose leadership the surviving members of the expedition decided to return home by circumnavigating the African continent. Of the original fleet of 5 ships, only one, the Victoria, was fortunate enough to overcome countless miles and hardships, finally anchoring off the coast of Spain on September 6, 1522, after 3 long years of wandering. On board the exhausted ship were only 18 weary sailors, destined to go down in history as the first people to circumnavigate the globe. This momentous journey marked a transition from a flat perception of the world to an understanding of its spherical shape. Magellan's expedition revolutionized humanity's geographical understanding, convincingly proving that the Earth is indeed a sphere, that oceans stretch across immeasurable expanses, that sea routes connect the most remote corners of the planet, and that humanity, scattered across various continents and islands, is a single whole. This was not just a voyage plotted on nautical charts. It was a true odyssey of the human mind, a severe test of faith, and a vivid testament to the boundless possibilities of the human spirit. Today, a globe is perceived as a commonplace object sitting on a school desk. However, to prove its reality, the pioneers had to endure violent storms, debilitating hunger, imminent death, and oppressive uncertainty. All this was accomplished by people driven by a great idea, one that was not visible to the naked eye, but in which they could believe wholeheartedly. Following the triumphant expeditions of Christopher Columbus and the circumnavigation of Ferdinand Magellan, the geocentric view of the world underwent irreversible changes. Unexplored lands ceased to be a matter of speculation and became tangible reality. This reality, like a magnet, attracted human flows, military fleets, and insatiable ambitions, marking the beginning of a new era of exploration, an era that was large-scale, purposeful, and often swift and brutal. Continents that had previously existed within their own laws and traditions became arenas of active European influence. In America, Spanish conquistadors launched a large-scale expansion into the uncharted territories. Missionaries vested with spiritual authority, brave soldiers, and government officials arrived on ships, erected impregnable fortresses, and established camps. They were driven by diverse motives: spreading the Christian faith, searching for legendary treasures, and creating new provinces to expand the empire. The conquests of conquistadors such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro became the most well-known. Hernán Cortés, leading a detachment of several hundred soldiers and securing the support of local tribes, managed to crush the mighty Aztec Empire in Mexico, a state with majestic temples, a developed culture, and a population of millions. Francisco Pizarro, in turn, destroyed the flourishing Inca state, which stretched across the Andes and the territory of modern-day Peru. Their victories became the epitome of Spanish expansion, but also turned into tragic events for the indigenous peoples of America, who faced ruthless conquest and loss of identity. The arrival of Europeans in the New World turned into a tragedy for the indigenous peoples, who faced diseases to which they had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, and influenza became invisible but deadly conquerors, claiming far more lives than weapons. Entire nations that had inhabited these lands for centuries were on the verge of extinction. Their territories were seized, and their cultural heritage was ruthlessly destroyed. It was a dramatic clash of civilizations, where Europeans had an undeniable advantage in the form of firearms, horses, and the support of royal courts. At the same time, Portugal was actively expanding its influence in Asia. Inspired by the success of Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese began creating a network of outposts along the coast of the Indian Ocean, including Mozambique, Goa on the west coast of India, Malacca, Ceylon, and even Macau in China. These points served not only as ports but also as crucial nodes in the trade network, through which flowed spices, silks, porcelain, pearls, jewels, and other exotic goods from the East. Unlike the Spanish, who sought to seize vast territories and turn them into colonies, the Portuguese were more selective, focusing on key trading points. They preferred not so much to conquer as to integrate into existing Asian trading systems, although violence and pressure also remained part of their strategy. At the forefront of spiritual expansion were missionaries, envoys of the Catholic Church, who diligently set off to the uncharted lands of the New World and mysterious Asia. They carried not only religious teachings, but also knowledge, seeking to convert peoples living far from European civilization. And while their mission was presented as spiritual enlightenment, the local population often saw them as representatives of foreign power and unwanted influence. At the same time, Spanish and Portuguese cartographers, like industrious bees, filled geographical maps with new names, each sounding like a challenge to the unknown: Peru, Brazil, the Philippines, Goa, Japan. The world, like a mosaic, gradually came together into a single picture, becoming increasingly understandable and accessible. If before maps were merely collections of myths and guesses, now they increasingly resembled a mirror reflection of reality, albeit with distortions dictated by a European perspective. By the mid-16th century, Spain and Portugal, like two mighty whales, were already engaged in lively trade across the globe. Ships, like swift birds, ploughed the oceans, delivering goods and carrying people into slavery. The transatlantic trade was born. Mass migrations of peoples began, often forcibly. The world entered the first stage of globalization, not yet fully realized, but already irreversible. And all these changes occurred with dizzying speed. In just one century, humanity saw more changes than in many previous eras. New cities arose, cultures intertwined, old empires collapsed, and new states were created. The boundaries of the world blurred, like watercolors in the rain. Some found untold wealth, some met their death, some discovered new horizons, and some forever lost the old ones. The initial era of exploration of the New World and Asia came to an end, laying the foundation for the subsequent development of empires, scientific discoveries, diplomatic relations, trade routes, cultural achievements, and new confrontations. This was not the final point, but a launching pad for continuous interaction between continents, peoples, and various concepts of human existence on a global scale. On the geographical map of the world, there are strategically important areas, narrow isthmuses connecting continents and separating oceans. One such key place is the Isthmus of Panama, a narrow strip of land connecting North and South America and separating the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Already in the first half of the 16th century, it became clear that the new continent was of enormous size. Crossing it by land took a long time, and ships, especially Spanish ones, needed a fast and reliable route between the two oceans. At first, this seemed like an impossible task, but in 1513, an event occurred that became a turning point in history. The Spanish conquistador Vasco Núñez de Balboa, overcoming dense tropical forests and mountain ranges of Central America, was the first European to see the waters of the Pacific Ocean from the coast of Panama. He called it the South Sea, unaware of its scale, features, and future role in human history. For the European world, this event marked the discovery of a new, previously unknown horizon, an endless ocean stretching towards Asian lands and promising a direct route to the untold riches of the East. However, between the expanses of the Atlantic and this new sea lay a wild, unconquered tropical land, which posed a serious obstacle. And although Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the Spanish conquistador, managed to cross it on foot, Europeans soon realized the strategic importance of this isthmus, which could be used to transfer people, precious gold, and various goods. Almost immediately, active attempts began to establish land routes through the impassable jungle. The local population, indigenous peoples, were turned into forced porters, forced to carry heavy loads through dangerous paths. Over time, the construction of primitive roads began, wooden, often swampy and difficult to pass, but still performing their function. Spanish colonizers founded cities on both coasts, Panama, located on the Pacific coast, and Nombre de Dios, sprawling on the Atlantic coast. Between these cities stretched caravans carrying gold mined from Peruvian mines by the hands of enslaved Incas. The precious metal was transported across the isthmus to ships waiting for cargo in the northeast. These caravans became vital arteries of the Spanish Empire, providing its economy with silver and gold. The Isthmus of Panama became a strategically important hub connecting two worlds, although it was not yet cut by a canal. As it happened in the 19th century, it already then began to play the role of a kind of bridge between two great oceans. Not only untold riches passed through it, but also valuable information, geographical maps, important letters, and orders. The isthmus became a kind of slot connecting two worlds, into which levers of power were inserted, allowing for the control of vast territories and peoples. The Panamanian land was a harsh test for man. The tropical climate provoked outbreaks of dangerous diseases, malaria and tropical fever, swarms of venomous insects, endless downpours, and dense, impassable jungles turned every crossing into a real struggle for survival. However, the desire to possess access to the waters of the Pacific Ocean proved stronger than any obstacle. At the same time, the daring idea arose in the minds of geostrategists about the possibility of digging a canal that would divide the continent and provide ships with a direct passage between the two oceans. Of course, this was just a bold dream aimed at the distant future, but the awareness of Panama's strategic importance arose even then, in the first half of the 16th century. Powerful empires originate with control over key routes, and these routes often run through such vulnerable but crucial points on the world map. In addition to precious cargo and gold, streams of people also pass through Panama. Sailors who survive shipwrecks, refugees, religious missionaries, government officials sent to new posts, and even scientists driven by a thirst for knowledge. All of them use this isthmus as a kind of portal, allowing them to move from one world to another. Panama itself, both its land and the growing city, gradually turned into a point of contact between East and West, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the past and the future. Thus, this narrow strip of land gradually acquired the status of a key element in the global logistics system, becoming the first step towards the creation of the Panama Canal, which, centuries later, would revolutionize global transport flows, changing them forever. But long before the advent of powerful machines and explosive technologies, before excavators and concrete locks, there were people on this land, people paving the way through impenetrable thickets, people carrying heavy loads with their last strength, people obsessed with the dream of connecting two great oceans. Their steps, persistent and uncertain, became the first pages in this grand history. By the 17th century, the geographical map of the world was transformed, losing the appearance of a mysterious scroll where mythical monsters lived and lifeless spaces stretched. The main continents acquired clear outlines, sea arteries were laid, and harbors were established. However, as the horizons of knowledge expanded, the desire to penetrate the most secret corners of the planet steadily increased, into the unexplored sea depths, into the deep regions of new lands, beyond the beaten paths. During this period, European powers faced not only geographical tasks, but also issues of establishing control, expanding influence, developing trade, and developing strategic plans. It was in the 17th century that active advancement began into the southern part of Africa and into the waters of mysterious Oceania. On the African continent, the Portuguese continued to strengthen their positions. Their strongholds, once just small settlements on the coast, gradually transformed into administrative centers. Connections were established with local rulers, political and economic alliances were concluded, and trade routes were established. Gold and spices ceased to be the sole goal of the Europeans. The slave market became increasingly important. Portuguese merchants and their European colleagues launched a large-scale network for the acquisition, transportation, and sale of enslaved Africans, who were primarily used to work on plantations in the New World. This dark page of history became an integral part of world expansion. Economic needs required an influx of labor, and it was sought in the south. At the same time, the interior of Africa was being explored. European expeditions sought to advance along river systems, study deltas, and penetrate deep into the continent. Although these enterprises were not on the same scale as sea voyages, they still contributed to the expansion of knowledge about the lands, climate, and the peoples inhabiting them. Cartographic materials were replenished, myths and legends were dispelled, and instead of a vague unknown, specific information and accurate data appeared more and more often. At the same time, the attention of researchers and traders is increasingly attracted to the vast and mysterious region of Oceania. Until recently, only mentioned in passing on sea charts, this part of the world is gradually revealing its secrets. Dutch navigators boldly rush into the southern latitudes, paving the way along the coasts of Australia, called New Holland, studying the coast of New Guinea and the Indonesian archipelago. It is important to note that these expeditions are not organized at the behest of monarchs, but rather by powerful trading corporations such as the Dutch East India Company, driven by the pursuit of profit, the search for new goods and markets, and the establishment of control over key trade routes. The company establishes trading posts, strengthens its fleet, and, along the way, discovers new lands. In 1642, Abel Tasman set sail, during which he discovered an island later named after him, Tasmania, and reached the shores of New Zealand. These lands, already inhabited by indigenous peoples, appear to Europeans as unexplored regions of the world, wild and remote for immediate colonization. Nevertheless, Tasman and dozens of other navigators gradually bring Oceania closer to the sphere of European interests, building a bridge between two worlds. In the historical arena of the 16th and 17th centuries, a galaxy of new powers emerged, striving for world domination. If Portugal and Spain previously held the lead, now the Netherlands, England, and France joined them, each with its own unique strategy. The Dutch, driven by a commercial spirit, focused on developing world trade. The English strengthened their naval power, while the French sought to spread their influence through cultural expansion and diplomatic efforts. A hidden rivalry unfolded between these powers for control over key territories in the south and east. Continents became arenas of struggle for spheres of influence, and islands acquired strategic importance as strongholds. Even the smallest pieces of land became valuable if they could serve as intermediate bases on the way to Asia or Australia. The era of great geographical discoveries gradually faded into the past, giving way to an era of systematic exploration, classification, and consolidation of new territories. By this time, the general outlines of the Earth were already known. Now, Europeans faced the task of understanding, describing, and exploiting its resources. Expeditions were increasingly accompanied by scientists such as geographers, astronomers, and botanists. They carefully recorded local features, studied flora and fauna, and described climatic conditions. Each new land became not just a geographical object, but an important element of the emerging global system. The era of great geographical discoveries was marked not only by a thirst for profit, but also by an unquenchable thirst for knowledge, crude violence, and sincere admiration for the magnificence of the surrounding world. This bizarre blend of motives gave rise to a new scientific and holistic picture of the planet, replacing mythological ideas and disparate information. All this happened in the silence of tropical bays, under the sound of sails and the dazzling glare of ocean waves, off the coasts where European flags were just beginning to assert their dominance. While the Western powers sailed the oceans, founded colonies, and sought the exoticism of the southern seas, an equally significant movement unfolded in the East. Russia, steadily expanding its borders in all directions, turned its gaze to the vast expanses stretching beyond the Urals, towards cold, mysterious, and boundless lands. Thus began the Eastern Odyssey, full of the silence of taiga forests, icy expanses, and amazing human perseverance. The first step of the Russians into Siberia was the campaign of Yermak Timofeyevich in 1581. With a small detachment of Cossacks, he crossed the Ural Mountains, defeated the troops of Khan Kuchum, and temporarily captured the capital, Kashlik. This event became a turning point, forcing Moscow to seriously consider the potential of the eastern lands for the first time. Despite the early death of Yermak, his campaign paved the way for other explorers and conquerors. New detachments followed him, forts began to appear along the rivers, and the Russians, step by step, advanced further into the Siberian territories. In the 16th century, the Siberian region seemed both ownerless and boundless. It was not hidden behind sea expanses or a veil of fog, but was in close proximity, as if existing outside of time. Vast territories, covered with dense forests, winding rivers, swampy marshes, majestic mountain ranges, and endless snow covers stretched to the east. Here lived peoples with unique languages, distinctive rituals, and beliefs that remained alien and incomprehensible to the Moscow state. However, for brave explorers, these lands represented new horizons, unexplored rivers, rich hunting grounds, and, of course, inexhaustible natural resources. One of the main incentives that prompted the Russians to advance to the east was the yasak, a tax in kind, levied in furs. Sable was of particular value, its fur being worth its weight in gold in Europe. Russia quickly realized that Siberia was a real treasure trove, filled with precious furs. Local chieftains, free Cossacks, and enterprising merchants formed armed detachments, erected fortified outposts, and engaged in negotiations or armed conflicts with indigenous peoples. Some tried to persuade, others coerced, and still others sought mutually beneficial compromises. Thus, step by step, the sphere of influence of the Russian state expanded. These expeditions were not like sea voyages undertaken on frigates equipped with cannons and gunpowder. They were grueling foot journeys, dangerous river rafting, harsh winters, and arduous paths through snowy plains and desolate forests. Explorers such as Yermak, Poyakov, Dezhnev, and Atlasov ventured deep into the mainland, not out. Of pure geographical interest, but for survival, the extraction of valuable resources and trade. But behind them, the empire relentlessly followed. They themselves may have been fugitives, adventurers, or desperate thrill seekers, but the lands they discovered became an integral part of the new Russia, expanding its borders and influence. The conquest of the Pacific Ocean was one of the most outstanding geographical discoveries in human history. In the distant year of 1639, the Cossack chieftain Ivan Mosvitin, leading a small detachment, reached the shores of the harsh sea of Okhotsk. This event marked the moment when the eastern edge of Eurasia, long perceived as something distant and unattainable, became a tangible reality, filled with the wind and the sound of sea waves. A few years later, in 1648, Semyon Dezhnev made an even more striking voyage. Passing through the waters of the Arctic Ocean, he managed to forge a path between Chukotka and Alaska, preceding the famous Bering by several decades. Dezhnev proved that Asia and America were not connected by land, but separated by a sea strait. This discovery, far ahead of its time, remained in the shadows for a long time, but today its historical significance is recognized throughout the world. The development of Siberia was not a triumphal procession with waving banners and loud speeches. It was a quiet, steady process carried out by the efforts of many people. Every winterer, hunter, and fortress builder contributed to the expansion of the state's borders. New cities arose on Siberian soil: Tobolsk, Tomsk, Yakutsk, Irkutsk, becoming strongholds for further advancement to the east. Gradually, a new map was formed, first in people's minds and then on paper. Russia expanded not through the ocean expanses, but through the vast internal territories. For the indigenous peoples of Siberia, the arrival of Russian settlers meant not only familiarity with new goods and laws, but also the emergence of new threats and changes in their traditional way of life. Often, diseases, violence, and displacement of the indigenous population from their inhabited territories came along with the settlers. However, there were also examples of adaptation, the emergence of mixed settlements, and new forms of coexistence. This process cannot be called a conquest in the classic European sense. Rather, it was a gradual drawing of a vast territory into the orbit of the Russian state, where the unique Russian river geography played a key role. The conquest of Siberia was carried out through the river arteries, the Ob, Yenisei, Lena, and Amur. These waterways turned into busy highways, along which rafts, boats, and trains of pioneers tirelessly traveled. New settlements grew along their banks, giving life to previously untouched lands. The rivers served simultaneously as a road connecting remote corners, an inexhaustible source of food, a natural boundary separating territories, and, finally, a living legend passed from mouth to mouth. They were known not just by their names, their character, flow characteristics, flood periods, and winter freezing features were studied with no less attention than European navigators studied navigational charts of the oceans. The Siberian expansion was distinguished not by external pomposity, but by depth of penetration. It was not accompanied by Gromkimi fanfares and the signing of lush diplomatic agreements, but its consequences were truly colossal. In just 1 century, Russia transformed from a continental state into a powerful trans-Eurasian power, whose borders stretched from the Baltic Sea to the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. It was a journey not so much of ships, but of ordinary people, armed with sleds, sharp axes, hiking pots, and holy icons, carefully stored in backpacks. They went to the east, often without hope of ever returning, driven not by a thirst for fame and recognition, but by harsh necessity. And yet their path turned out to be no less significant and fateful than the famous expeditions of Magellan or Columbus. By the beginning of the 15th century, the geographical map of the world had ceased to resemble a mysterious drawing populated by mythical monsters, giant sea fish, and ghostly hypothetical lands. The uncharted white spaces gradually disappeared from it, giving way to clear coastlines, the names of bustling ports, and detailed indications of ocean currents and prevailing wind directions. But it wasn't just a geographical transformation that was taking place. The very perception of the world was changing. People began to realize the Earth as a single, holistic space, visible and measurable. Every new journey, every story of an experienced person, every marked coordinate in a ship's logbook turned into a grain of the huge picture that humanity began to put together with the keenest interest and amazement. The geographical map of the world expanded not only in the literal sense, but also in terms of knowledge. The development of previously unknown lands led to the need for new ways to describe them. Professional geographers, topographers, and cartographers came onto the scene. There was no longer room for speculation, legends, and retellings in their work, as was the case in the Middle Ages. From now on, measurements, observations, and calculations were paramount. People began to calculate the parameters of the earth, seas, and the celestial sphere. The time had come when maps began to be created, not for the pleasure of the eye, but to achieve maximum accuracy. Evolution went from bizarre outlines to a clear navigational coordinate system. Each new expedition provided information that was immediately included in the overall system of knowledge. Sailors entered data on depths, currents, and features of the coastline in watchlogs. Merchants compiled descriptions of goods and markets. Missionaries kept records of the languages and customs of different peoples. Learned men compiled the first scientific descriptions of the animal and plant world. All this knowledge flowed into universities, libraries, and onto the tables of monarchs. Maps ceased to be whole objects of secret knowledge, turning into instruments of politics, science, and trade. Maritime atlases began to play an invaluable role in the era of geographical discoveries, among which the palm belonged to Dutch publications, especially maps created by Gerard Mercator and his followers. It was this outstanding cartographer who proposed a projection that is still widely used in marine navigation today. The uniqueness of this projection lay in the ability to plot direct routes on the globe, which turned the map from a simple geographical image into an indispensable navigational tool. Thanks to the introduction of such systems, naval flotillas were able to carefully plan their voyages, avoid dangerous reefs, and choose the most profitable routes. Thus, the world became more predictable and manageable, with the help of paper, ink, and a ruler. However, nautical charts of that time served not only to describe land and sea, they also began to record and display the spheres of influence of various states. Maps began to show color designations of colonial possessions, arrows indicating the directions of trade routes and the boundaries of empires. Cartography at that time focused more and more not only on the natural features of territories, but also on political geography. The process of global rethinking of space began. Now it was not enough to simply know where a particular land was located. It was important to understand who controlled it, what peoples inhabited it, and what resources it possessed. The discovery of new territories stimulated the development of education and science. Academies of navigation began to open in many countries, where future captains gained the knowledge and skills necessary to read maps, measure coordinates by the stars, and keep ship logs. Geography, increasingly intertwined with the needs of practice, raised those who created maps to a pedestal, turning them into sought-after specialists. Cartographers, from now on not just observers, but active participants in research expeditions, shared with them the hardships and triumphs of great discoveries. The desire to expand the boundaries of the known world gripped not only European maritime powers. Russia, the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and China also felt the need for new lands. These states, striving for a more accurate understanding of their neighbors, sent messengers and carefully collected information. Chinese cartographers, relying on European data, created their own maps, adapting them to the national coordinate system and cultural characteristics. Thus, the map of the world, without becoming unified in terms of agreement, expanded in terms of coverage. By the 17th century, the world had entered a new era. The Earth ceased to be a disjointed collection of isolated worlds. It has become a single space where everything is interconnected. Trade routes connected America and China via Europe. Gold from Peru flowed to Spain, from there to Holland, then to India and Africa. People, ideas, diseases, and technologies all moved along new highways. The map reflecting not only the geographical location, but also the dynamics of movement, turned into a living, pulsating organism. In an era before technological advancements gifted humanity with the telegraph and steamships, a realization of our planet's finite nature was already taking root in people's minds. There was a burgeoning desire to measure the Earth, explore its vastness, and comprehend its essence. Each new discovery, whether an island or a coastline, seemed to shrink the world, making it more accessible and familiar. This evoked both excitement and a subtle unease. The age of tranquility was fading, and the unknown was giving way to a sense of responsibility for the territories being conquered. When the first ships departed from European ports in the 10th century, they carried not only crews, goods, and provisions, but also transformed humanity's perception of itself. Prior to the age of exploration, Earth existed in people's consciousness more as an abstract concept than a tangible sphere. The world was divided into the familiar and the mythical, the own and the foreign, the central and the peripheral. What lay beyond the horizon remained a mystery. However, as sails began to traverse distant seas and the outlines of coastlines multiplied on maps, the understanding of the planet underwent a radical shift. This was not merely a refinement of geographical forms, but also the formation of a new perception of the world, its scale, structure, and reality. One of the most significant shifts was the gradual acceptance of the Earth's spherical shape, which fundamentally altered the worldview of people. Long before the epical voyages of Columbus and Magellan, the minds of ancient philosophers and astronomers had already contemplated the Earth's round form. However, in medieval Europe, this remained more of a theoretical knowledge than an empirically confirmed fact. It was the great geographical discoveries that transformed this hypothesis into an irrefutable truth, proven by measurements and circumnavigations. Magellan's expeditions served as a clear confirmation of the Earth's spherical shape. His ship, having circumnavigated the globe, returned to its starting point. This event had a profound impact on people's worldview. Humanity realized that the Earth was not the center of the universe, that other continents, civilizations, and cosmologies existed. The diversity of cultures, languages, beliefs, and historical paths shattered previous simplistic notions of the world. It became evident that the world was not limited to Europe and the Middle East. Geographical pluralism contributed to a new perception of humanity. Science, especially astronomy and geography, received a powerful impetus for development. Determining longitude and latitude, observing celestial bodies, studying ocean currents became not just applied tasks, but part of the pursuit of understanding the planet. Navigational tables, star charts, theories of the Earth's movement developed, and an interest in global symmetry, relief, and the distribution of climatic zones arose. Even understanding the change of seasons in the southern hemisphere or the reverse direction of storms broadened the horizons of human thought. The age of exploration marked the beginning of global spatial thinking. People began to think in terms of continents and oceans, in trade, politics, religion, and everyday life. An understanding of the interconnectedness of events occurring in different parts of the world emerged. Events in Japan, crop failures in Brazil, gold in Mexico, spices in Malacca, all of this was gradually linked into a single system, not yet visible, but already palpable. The age of exploration was marked not only by the expansion of physical horizons, but also by a fundamental transformation of humanity's mental maps. Previous ideas about borders, about the center and periphery of the world, about the division into civilized and barbarian peoples, lost their steadfastness, becoming fluid and relative. Lands that were once considered remote and insignificant peripheries suddenly found themselves in the focus of universal attention, arousing interest, delight, and sometimes envy. Peoples who had previously been classified as mythical or primitive appeared as bearers of deep and complex systems of knowledge, striking examples of architecture and art. European conquerors, striving to conquer new lands, unwittingly became students, enriching themselves with the wisdom and experience of other cultures. This new understanding of the Earth as a diverse and multi-voiced world, where each region possesses its unique place, role, and truth, gradually took root in people's consciousness. At the same time, an awareness of the fragility of our planet emerged. Travelers, having completed circumnavigations, became convinced of the finite nature of the Earth's space. Limited masses of continents, surrounded by boundless expanses of water, appeared before their eyes. The territory accessible to humans turned out to be not limitless, but quite tangible. In this context, a new philosophy was born, a philosophy of limits, based on the realization that the Earth is our common and only home. The age of exploration did not just map new outlines of continents and oceans, it changed the very perception of the space in which we live. The planet seemed to shrink in size, becoming more understandable and accessible, yet simultaneously reminding us of the countless mysteries still to be uncovered. Old illusions crumbled, giving way to new perceptions of the world. Most importantly, a new feeling awakened in people, the realization that we live not on an abstract Earth, but on a planet with defined boundaries, its own laws, unique terrain, and unparalleled life forms. This very feeling served as a powerful impetus for the development of science, cosmology, ecology, and philosophy in the centuries that followed. The age of exploration marked a rapid surge in global trade, becoming one of its most tangible and visible outcomes. The discovery of sea routes to India, the shores of America, along the African continent, and to the islands of Oceania opened doors to previously unseen riches for Europe. Goods that were once delivered in limited quantities via complex and costly land routes now flowed like a river into European markets. Ships traversing the seas brought gold and silver, exotic spices, exquisite silk, fragrant tea, cane sugar, invigorating coffee, delicate cotton, rare woods, sparkling pearls, tart cocoa, tobacco, and a host of other wondrous goods to European ports. Each cargo was more than just a collection of items. It was a story, a tale of a distant journey, of unique climates and distinctive cultures. Trade routes became bustling arteries, circulating not only capital, but also influence, ideas, and human destinies. In this new global system, maritime powers like Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, England, and France played a key role. They created powerful fleets, supported by the state or private companies. The Dutch and British East India Companies essentially became states in miniature, possessing their own ships, armies, and flags. They waged wars, concluded international agreements, and seized new territories. Their activities transformed trade from a simple exchange of goods into a powerful tool of geopolitics. Control over key ports, strategic straits, and sea routes became more important than the goods themselves. Mastery of the sea meant control over the global economy. Cities were transformed, becoming key centers of global commerce. Lisbon, Amsterdam, London, Seville. These metropolises became not just administrative centers, but true portals through which European civilization interacted with other continents. Large-scale port complexes, extensive warehouses, financial exchanges, banking institutions, and insurance companies emerged. Logistical schemes were refined, reliable shipping lines were formed, standardized standards were introduced, and maritime record-keeping flourished. The merchant class ceased to be the domain of individuals. Commercial activity evolved into a complex system involving thousands of people from different professions, from experienced navigators to government officials overseeing tax collection, from ship owners to workers loading and unloading goods. In parallel with the growth of material wealth, the exchange of intellectual achievements accelerated. The lands being discovered supplied not only new goods, but also valuable information. Europeans received detailed descriptions of exotic plants, wondrous beasts, unique climatic conditions, geological formations, and also became acquainted with foreign languages and religious beliefs. This served as a powerful stimulus for the development of various scientific disciplines. Geography was transformed into an exact science with measurable parameters. Astronomy became an indispensable tool for navigation, and natural science helped to understand the diversity of the surrounding world. Scientific collections began to form, initially private, then university and state-owned. They were filled with stuffed exotic animals, herbaria with rare plants, mineral specimens, seashells, cult artifacts, unusual masks, and statuettes. These exhibits stirred minds, sparked lively discussions, and stimulated the creation of innovative classifications. A remarkable era of knowledge systematization dawned, when learned men, driven by an unquenchable thirst for order, embarked on the grand task of organizing the surrounding world, striving to meticulously describe, accurately measure, and impartially compare all that existed. It was during this period that the first encyclopedic compendiums flourished. Authoritative scientific societies emerged, and celebrated academies of sciences were created, becoming centers of intellectual thought. Inspired by all this accumulated diversity of the living world, Carl Linnaeus created his famous system of naming living things, revolutionizing biological systematics. Of particular significance is the fact that science is gradually ceasing to be speculative and abstract, becoming increasingly practice-oriented. The age of great geographical discoveries urgently demanded applied knowledge capable of bringing real benefits. Astronomy, for example, found its application in the precise determination of geographical coordinates, which was vital for seafarers. Mathematical methods, in turn, were used to calculate sailing distances, determine the load capacity of ships, and calculate interest rates in trade operations. Cartographic materials became increasingly accurate and detailed, celestial tables more reliable, and navigation instruments more compact and convenient to use. During this period, active training of qualified specialists began, such as naval officers, experienced navigators, and talented engineers capable of solving complex, technical problems. Universities, responding to the challenges of the time, began to pay more attention to applied disciplines, preparing personnel for the developing economy. However, trade and science did not develop in isolation from each other, but were closely intertwined, forming an inseparable whole. Each maritime expedition turned into a scientific enterprise, and each new product became an occasion for thorough research. Pepper and cinnamon, for example, ceased to be mere seasonings, turning into objects of close botanical interest. Cocoa, tobacco, and tea became not just popular drinks, but subjects of lively medical and philosophical discussions, sparking debates about their beneficial and harmful properties. Even seaweed and corals, striking in their unusual beauty, aroused universal admiration and an irresistible desire to understand their nature and origin. This was one of the deep shifts of the era. Trade became not only a powerful engine of the economy, but also a driving force of knowledge, stimulating scientific research and discovery. The thirst for profit gave rise to a thirst for understanding, and the thirst for understanding, in turn, expanded the horizons of trade, creating new opportunities for economic growth. It was a closed circle in which the entire era revolved, fueling progress and development. Ships sailing the seas and oceans carried not only valuable spices and exquisite fabrics, but also invaluable books, accurate maps, complex astrolabes, and detailed diaries containing the results of scientific observations and discoveries. In the age of great geographical discoveries, when ships sailed the oceans, connecting disparate parts of the world, the idea of the universal interconnectedness of phenomena was born. It was then that the concept arose that knowledge is not just separate fragments of information, but a holistic system amenable to study, description, and explanation. These ideas became the foundation for the philosophy of the Enlightenment. It all began in bustling port cities, aboard ships, where exhausted navigators, illuminating their records with the flickering light of oil lamps, recorded the coordinates of new lands. The discovery of uncharted territories entailed not only the movement of goods and the dissemination of knowledge, but also the clash of different worldviews. For the first time in human history, representatives of different civilizations began to interact on a regular basis. People raised in different systems of values, religions, languages, and social structures met each other on tropical islands, in the jungles of the Amazon, in Chinese harbors, and in African markets. These meetings could be peaceful, tense, cruel, or surprisingly warm, but they were always significant. Each such contact became a point of cultural exchange, and sometimes of absorption or disappearance. Europeans brought with them writing, technology, religious ideas, and new views on the structure of the world. In response, they encountered a variety of forms of life and thought that did not correspond to their previous ideas. They discovered societies without castles, but with developed systems of spiritual and social hierarchy, languages without an alphabet, but with rich poetic content, communities without private property, but with a stable internal order. Such discoveries aroused astonishment, fear, interest, and often a desire for transformation and the imposition of their values. One of the most large-scale channels of cultural exchange was missionary activity, which spread religious and cultural values around the world. During the age of great geographical discoveries, Christian missionaries, especially members of the Jesuit order, rushed to distant lands, to South America, to the expanses of Asia, to the Philippine Islands, to Japan and China. They brought the light of the Christian faith to the peoples of these lands, engaging in education, performing baptisms, and translating sacred texts of the Bible into local languages. Many of them showed genuine interest and deep respect for the culture of the countries in which they found themselves, striving to understand and accept it. Some missionaries became true intermediaries, building bridges of understanding between different civilizations. A prime example is Matteo Ricci, a Jesuit who worked in China. He meticulously studied Confucianism, created works in Chinese, and attempted to explain Western scientific achievements using terms understandable to the Eastern mindset. However, alongside such enlightened figures, there were also fanatical missionaries who indulged in destroying ancient manuscripts, demolishing temples, and declaring any cultural expressions not aligned with their religious beliefs as machinations of the devil. A similar process of exchange occurred in everyday life. Agricultural products such as tomatoes, corn, potatoes, cocoa, tobacco, various types of peppers, and pumpkins were brought from the Americas to Europe. These foods gradually entered the European diet, significantly influencing the culinary traditions of entire nations. Simultaneously, horses, sheep, wheat, sugarcane, and grapevines were brought to the New World from Europe, along with the European way of life. Two-story houses with bell towers, crosses erected on hilltops, and clothing made of wool and broadcloth. The peoples of conquered territories adopted European technologies, but also sought to preserve elements of their unique culture, adapting them to new conditions, reinterpreting them, and sometimes skillfully masking them under the guise of foreign traditions. However, cultural exchange was not always peaceful and voluntary. It was often accompanied by forced assimilation, where foreign cultures were imposed on indigenous peoples, suppressing their own traditions and customs. History holds many examples of irrevocably lost languages and forgotten customs. In the colonial era, conquerors established educational institutions in subordinate lands where the young generation of indigenous inhabitants were forced to speak exclusively in the language of the metropolis, severely punished for using their native tongue. Ancient rites and ceremonies were declared manifestations of barbarism, and local deities were reduced to primitive idols. The architectural appearance of cities, musical art, and political structure underwent a radical restructuring in accordance with alien standards. The age of exploration became a period of ruthless cultural suppression, an integral part of global colonial expansion. However, despite the aggressive imposition of foreign orders, there was also an inevitable intermingling of cultures, giving rise to new forms of self-identification. In Latin America, syncretic religious movements emerged, blending elements of Catholicism with traditional beliefs of African and indigenous peoples. In the Caribbean, Creole languages formed, incorporating the vocabulary and grammar of various cultures. In Asian countries, European motifs penetrated architecture, fashion, and education, giving life to hybrid cultural forms in which it was difficult to draw a clear line between the indigenous and the imported. In European states themselves, the perception of other cultures and peoples changed. Literary works appeared, capturing the manners and customs of overseas countries, ranging from enthusiastic descriptions to condescending colonial assessments. Some authors admired the wisdom and harmonious organization of the Inca and Chinese civilizations, while others saw in them only savagery and a potential threat to European culture. The descriptions born in that era profoundly influenced the formation of the image of the other in the European consciousness, which was subsequently reflected in philosophy, politics, and art. The cultural interactions of that time were not short-lived episodes. They left indelible marks on history. Archives of missionary expeditions, ancient rock carvings, folk songs and legends, as well as loanwords in language, all testify to the events of bygone days. Every Christian church built on the site of a destroyed pagan temple, Every folk song where the image of a Christian saint is intricately intertwined with local beliefs. Every culinary dish in which African spices enriched European cuisine. All are vivid examples of both great convergence and serious clashes of cultures. The age of exploration was also an era of anthropological transformation. People began to see each other, to recognize existing differences, to sympathize with the pain of others, and to admire the strength of spirit. Despite the surfacing of vices such as greed, cruelty, and the desire for domination, a new understanding gradually arose in the depths of human consciousness, an awareness of the multifaceted nature of humanity. Not everyone was ready to accept this idea, but it had already become firmly entrenched in life, and from that moment on, humanity, regardless of its future development path, could no longer exist in isolation. In an era when the horizons of the seas were being plied by the first European ships, an insatiable thirst for exploration hung in the air. The ocean seemed like a boundless arena for discovery, and new lands beckoned like unexplored pages of history, waiting to be read. Initially, the interaction was cautious. Trading posts arose, lively trade was conducted, symbolic gifts were exchanged, and attempts were made to establish mutual understanding between cultures. However, over time, the situation underwent a radical change. The spirit of adventurism transformed into a clearly structured system. The discovery of new lands became synonymous with power and domination. Europeans, having set foot on unexplored shores, had no intention of leaving them. Colonialism did not arise instantly, as if by magic. Conquest was not its initial goal. On the contrary, it skillfully masqueraded as mutually beneficial cooperation. The first steps were the construction of fortresses, warehouses for storing goods, and the establishment of missionary settlements. Subsequently, these strongholds acquired garrisons, and then a bureaucratic apparatus. Only decades later did it become obvious that this was no longer just a point on the map, but a territory where life would be subject to new rules brought from across the ocean. Colonial expansion encompassed three vast regions: the New World, Africa, and Asia. On the American continents, Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors created viceroyalties and ruthlessly seized lands where the majestic cities of the Incas and Aztecs once stood. In the vastness of India, in the lands of Southeast Asia, off the coasts of China and Japan, European trading posts began to appear, which eventually turned into powerful forts. Along the western and eastern coasts of Africa, impregnable fortresses grew, serving first as centers of brisk trade, and then turning into strongholds for the enslavement of entire peoples. In these regions, the system of power changed dramatically. Local rulers found themselves either in the role of puppets, obediently carrying out the will of the colonizers, or became ardent opponents of the new order. Lands passed into the possession of distant metropolises, and the economy underwent a radical restructuring. The fields were no longer cultivated with traditional crops, but with those that brought the greatest profit overseas. Huge plantations, mines, and quarries appeared, where the labor of forcibly selected people was used as a workforce. Enslaved peoples, displaced from their lands and shackled in chains, toiled under relentless supervision. Colonies ceased to exist for their own sake, turning into appendages that ensured the prosperity of an external force. In this ruthless system, profound changes occurred in the culture of the enslaved peoples. Languages, religions, education, rituals, everything was subjected to rigid correction. children were taught in a foreign language, temples were destroyed or reconsecrated in accordance with new beliefs, and the history of the people was rewritten to erase the memory of the past. The boundaries between the indigenous and the imposed were blurred, depriving peoples of their identity and spiritual roots. However, parallel to this, opposite phenomena unfolded. Indigenous cultures skillfully integrated into the structure of the colonial era, giving rise to innovative forms of self-awareness, multifaceted, ambiguous, and at the same time powerful. Colonialism transformed from a simple political strategy into a holistic worldview, dividing the world into a dominant center and a dependent periphery, into those who rule and those who obey. It introduced into the future global community the concepts of hierarchy, hegemony, and superiority. These ideas would retain their vitality for many years, even after the formal liquidation of the colonies, taking root in institutions, language, architecture, and the psychology of relations between peoples. In the shadow of this historical heritage, the 20th century would also be formed. For European states, this was a time of extensive development. Precious metals, spices, sugar, cotton, tea, cocoa, tobacco, all these resources enriched the economy of the metropolises, stimulated the financing of science, art, and construction. Bourgeois elites arose, trade flourished, and empires expanded. But behind this triumph lay the losses of other peoples. Destroyed cultures, vanished languages, exterminated ethnic groups, lost ways of life. The era of geographical discoveries turned into an era of enslavement. Colonialism became a logical continuation of the initial stage of exploration. The initial admiration for the boundless world gave way to a desire to make it comfortable and controllable. Thus, gradually, humanity went from terra incognita to a territory divided between powerful powers. Despite this chronicle being filled with tragic events, ignoring it would be an unforgivable mistake. Only through a deep understanding of the past, paying tribute to the fallen, and admiring the courage of those who resisted, can we gain a fresh perspective on the modern political map of the world. Perhaps then we will realize that the true greatness of humanity lies not in conquest and subjugation, but in the capacity for empathy and mutual understanding. What matters more than artificial borders dividing nations are the strong ties that unite them. The value lies not in treasures accumulated at the expense of others, but in the voices of all who have contributed to the shared history. All of the above is not just a list of dates, names, and geographical routes. It is a story of humanity's spiritual awakening. It is a tale of how people first became aware of the true scale of the planet, felt the alluring freedom of the horizons, and took the first steps towards a global, all-encompassing perception of the world. The age of great geographical discoveries not only revealed previously unknown lands to the world, but also fundamentally transformed human thinking. It taught us to see the Earth not as a mythical space, but as a detailed map, not as an incomprehensible mystery, but as a fascinating journey full of opportunities. These momentous discoveries expanded not only geographical, but also cultural, scientific, and philosophical boundaries. They provided humanity with a unique opportunity to see itself reflected in other civilizations, to appreciate the diversity, complexity, and amazing beauty of our world. It is fair to note that the age of great geographical discoveries, along with its undeniable achievements, brought humanity a lot of misfortune. Bloody conflicts, the expansion of colonialism, and large-scale destruction. However, it was then that the awareness of shared responsibility for the fate of the planet was born. A desire for constructive dialogue between cultures arose, and the long and difficult path to the harmonious coexistence of all peoples of the earth began. This eventful era demonstrates the full spectrum of human aspirations, from bold dreams and daring ambitions to tragic mistakes made under the influence of power and the boundless power of scientific knowledge. The history of great discoveries calls not for blind repetition of the past, but for a deep understanding of the lessons of the past. Perhaps it is worth drawing a quiet but important conclusion. True discovery begins not with the appearance of a sail on the horizon, but with the questions we ask ourselves, looking into the vast sky or studying a map of the world. What do we know about the planet we live on? And who will we become when we gain new knowledge? Close your eyes and let your imagination paint a picture. A majestic ship silhouetted against the setting sun, the creaking of old boards, a scattering of stars above the masts, and the figure of a person standing at the helm. This is not just a captain, but a true pioneer, the creator of their own destiny. Let this image remain in your memory as a reminder that the human path is endless, as long as we are alive, as long as we remember the past, and as long as we continue to seek answers to eternal questions.